Kelsey, my daughter-in-law, smiled as she said it. You should stay out of photos. Still, I raised the camera, steadying my hands, the words lingering like a bitter scent. As the shutter clicked, I captured more than just their smiles. I captured the silence between us, the unspoken tension. While Kelsey posed for the perfect shot, I realized what I had to do. That's when I decided. The next album would be mine, and this time, the world would see me. No longer hidden, no longer erased. My truth, unfiltered. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The Easter brunch table looked like a postcard. All pastel dresses, sharp smiles, and the sharp scent of ham. But Irene Whitmore only saw it through the lens of her camera. She'd spent decades capturing moments like this. Moments that weren't hers, but that she made hers in the click of a shutter. The family posed dutifully, seated around the table, their laughter light, their faces all brightened by the golden late-morning sunlight that slanted through the French doors. Irene's hands were steady, the camera a familiar weight, even though it had been years since she had done a professional shoot. A flick of her wrist, the shutter clicked. She never looked at the screen. She knew the shot was perfect before the moment was even captured. "Smile, everyone," Irene said softly, but her eyes stayed fixed on the lens. The family smiled as directed, their faces poised in that specific way that told the world they were happy. But Irene knew them too well. She knew the words left unspoken, the tension beneath the surface. Kelsey, sitting across from Carter, was the first to break the illusion. She leaned in, low enough that Irene almost missed it, her voice a soft, venomous whisper. "She really should stay out of photos. It's better." It was said as casually as one would comment on the weather, but it landed with the weight of a slap. Irene's fingers tightened around the camera, and her breath, for a split second, caught in her chest. Her world didn't stop, though. She didn't flinch outwardly, she couldn't. The camera became her shield, the click of the shutter an armor to deflect the pain. She let it cover her silence. Her heart hammered, but her hands were still steady. She let the moment unfold without a word. Her face remained impassive, as though the insult had never existed. She shifted the camera slightly, capturing a candid of Lily in the background, distracted by something outside. The younger woman had a rare kind of gentleness in her eyes, like she could see right through to Irene's soul. Irene flicked the lens back to her son, Carter. He sat there, pretending not to notice anything, his gaze fixed at the plate in front of him. He never did speak up, not when it mattered. Lily caught her eye then. Irene didn't look away. But in that brief second of eye contact, Irene saw it. The faint flinch in Lily's expression. She saw the way her granddaughter's gaze hardened for a fraction of a second before she returned to what she was doing. Lily, ever the observer, ever the quiet one. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. But then, like the glimmer of a distant star in a dark sky, Gwen leaned over during the cleanup. "What you heard?" Gwen's voice was a murmur, low and almost conspiratorial. "That wasn't about photos." Irene's heart squeezed in her chest, but she didn't respond. Instead, she let the chaos of the table dissipate, the clink of plates and cutlery somehow filling the silence that was suffocating her. She busied herself with packing up her camera gear, pretending it didn't matter, pretending it didn't hurt. But Gwen's words echoed. They hadn't been about photos at all, had they? The house was quiet when everyone left. The hum of the refrigerator was too loud, too final in the otherwise still air. Irene wandered through the house, back to the old studio in the basement. Her eyes were blurry now, not with tears, but with the sheer weight of a lifetime's worth of unspoken words. She ran her fingers along the shelves until her hand stopped at a box. Dust covered the label. Negatives, not yet developed. She pulled it down carefully, as if it were fragile, as if it were the last piece of herself she could cling to. The box was full of moments, portraits, snapshots of family, of her life, her history, the faces that never saw her, the faces that never looked back at her. She opened the box slowly, the sound of the cardboard creaking like an old memory. There, in the dim light of the basement, Irene found the negatives. Some of them were faded, others were sharp, capturing faces she knew by heart. A lifetime of people who thought they could erase her, but here, in this box, she was always there, waiting to be seen again. She could almost feel the weight of Kelsey's words pressing down on her. Stay out of photos. It was more than that. It was a way of saying she didn't matter. It was a way of saying she didn't deserve to be remembered. Her fingers brushed over the negatives, trembling slightly as she picked them up. Her thoughts turned cold, focused, and clear. She dialed Pastor Elias's number, her voice calm despite the fire burning behind it. "I want to fund a final exhibit," Irene said, her words slow but deliberate, "but not for them." The line was quiet for a beat. Irene could almost hear the wheels turning on the other end of the phone. "You sure about that, Irene?" "I'm sure," she said, the resolve in her voice sharper than the click of her camera shutter. "Let's make sure they see what they've been trying to crop out." The phone call ended. Irene stared at the box of negatives for a long moment, her heart still racing. But the direction now clear. She wouldn't let them erase her. Not this time. The world would see her. They'd see her, unfiltered and uncropped. They would never forget her again. And this time, she wouldn't be behind the lens. She'd be in the frame. The album sat heavy in Irene's lap, a thick leather-bound thing that had lived on the shelf, buried beneath dust for years. She opened it slowly, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages, feeling the weight of each photograph. The first one was from her wedding, a black and white shot that still managed to catch the light in her eyes. She looked young, hopeful. Carter, barely 10 years old at the time, stood beside her, smiling broadly, his father's hand on his shoulder. The picture still had the smell of spring about it, a time before things began to fray at the edges. She flipped through the pages one by one, and with each one, the ache in her chest grew deeper. There were family vacations, moments with friends, portraits taken at holidays, but the same thing kept staring back at her. She wasn't in most of them. In the 28 years she'd spent as a mother and grandmother, she was only in 6 photos. 6. She paused at one, a Thanksgiving dinner. Her family gathered around the table, their smiles forced but still polite. She was there, of course, but her face was half hidden behind a plate of mashed potatoes. She couldn't remember who took the photo. Carter, probably, or maybe Kelsey. But the strangest part was how it felt like she was an afterthought. An object placed in the frame but not allowed to be seen. Her eyes moved across the pages, past the images of Kelsey in various poses, radiant in every shot. Kelsey was the centerpiece of every moment, the one who appeared in every family card, every social media post, every gift sent to relatives. Kelsey, always perfectly arranged, her hair glossy, her smile flawless, always smiling, always the perfect curated version of family. The contrast was unbearable. Irene slammed the album shut, the sound of the leather closing too loud in the silence of the room. She swallowed, but the lump in her throat didn't go away. Gwen's voice echoed in her mind. "She's curated you out of your own life." It was true. Kelsey had made sure of it. She had taken control of everything that looked perfect in their family, photos, cards, memories, and Irene had been left out. There had been moments, subtle moments, where Irene tried to reclaim something. A candid photo here or there. A small gesture, a laugh. But Kelsey had always known how to hide them, tuck them away where they wouldn't be seen, where they wouldn't matter. The bitterness burned in her throat, but Irene didn't have time to wallow. Not anymore. She stood up abruptly, knocking the album to the floor, and walked over to the filing cabinet in the corner of the room. She didn't even need to think. She knew exactly where to go. She pulled open the drawer, digging through it with purpose. There it was. A folder, yellowing with age, stuffed with loose papers and old photos. She slid it out, feeling the weight of it in her hands. As she opened it, a soft, almost sorrowful laugh escaped her lips. It was full of photos of Kelsey. Every single one of them was a carefully posed center frame shot, with Kelsey's face angled just so, her body always turned toward the camera, always in the spotlight. There were holiday dinners, weekends at the lake house, family gatherings, and in every single one, Kelsey was the star. Irene was barely a shadow in the background. Sometimes, just a hand reaching for a dish. Sometimes, just a figure on the edge of the frame, hidden by someone else's body. Kelsey had woven herself into the fabric of the family's story, and Irene had been left to fade into the background, just like the ghost she sometimes felt like. Irene's heart clenched as she closed the folder with a snap. Her gaze landed on the next thing she needed, Lily's photography portfolio. She hadn't seen it in a while, but she knew exactly where it was, tucked into the top drawer of her old desk where Lily had left it after the last visit. Irene took it out carefully, the smell of old paper and ink filling the air. She opened it to the first page where Lily's photos, beautiful, raw, and full of life, captured moments Irene had never thought to preserve. Laughing on the porch, holding a cup of tea, her hair a wild mess, but her face full of light. There were no filters here, no perfect poses, no forced smiles. Just Irene, alive, in motion, in color. A version of herself Kelsey had never cared to see, much less share. Lily's eyes were everywhere in these photos. She had seen Irene in ways no one else had. She saw her the way Irene had always wanted to be seen. She saw her not just as mother, not just as grandmother, but as a woman, full, complex, whole. Irene paused on a photo of herself, mid-laugh, with flowers scattered across her face. Her hands were outstretched, and she was grinning like a woman who had forgotten time. Irene smiled, a rare, soft expression crossing her face. She looked beautiful. She didn't recognize that woman in the mirror, not often enough, but in this photo, she saw her. The real her, not the one Kelsey had erased. Lily had done this for her. Had made Irene feel seen. It was enough to make the fire burn a little brighter inside her. She flipped to the last page of the portfolio where Lily had written, in her perfect script, "You don't see yourself the way I do." Irene paused, staring at the words for a long moment. Then, finally, she whispered, as much to herself as to the empty room, "Then let's show them the version they tried to crop." Her fingers moved with determination and she pulled out her phone, dialing Lily's number before she could second-guess herself. It was time. It was time for them to see the truth. Irene sat at the old wooden table, its surface worn from decades of use. She had spread the photos out like treasure maps, each one telling a story she'd forgotten or chosen not to remember. The images were a silent rebellion, moments caught between laughter and stillness, snapshots of a woman not erased, but hidden. Each frame was a voice, each angle a demand for attention, and every click of the shutter was a refusal to be forgotten. Gwen sat beside her, her fingers skimming over the edges of the pictures with the care of someone who'd seen it all before. The corners of the old photographs were frayed, some of the black and white ones almost faded beyond recognition, but Gwen's eyes never faltered. "You know, Irene," she said, her voice low but steady. She's taken so much from you. These moments are more than just pictures. They're you. Irene didn't answer immediately, her hands moving methodically, sifting through the pile as if each picture held a secret that could only be revealed in its proper time. She found herself stopping at a photograph from 25 years ago, her sitting in the kitchen, hands flour-dusted as she laughed with Carter, who was trying to steal a spoonful of batter. Her hair was untamed, and the years hadn't yet hardened her smile. The woman in that photo was soft, untouched by judgment, alive. She had nearly forgotten how vibrant she looked in that moment, how much joy there was in her that she had long buried. This woman, she realized, had been pushed into the shadows. She was the one Kelsey didn't want anyone to see. "What about this one?" Gwen asked, pulling a newer shot from the pile. It was a candid that Lily had taken, Irene sitting cross-legged on the porch, the evening sun casting a warm glow over her. She was staring out at something, perhaps nothing. But there was a peace in her expression. In the background, the silhouette of the house seemed to lean toward her, like it was part of the scene. "It's perfect," Irene murmured, her voice distant. Gwen studied the photo for a long moment, her brow furrowed. "It's not just a photo, Irene. It's a whole story they've never let people see. You're not just a backdrop, not a prop to be tucked out of sight when the picture gets too real." She paused, her fingers brushing the edges of the image with reverence. "You're still in these moments. You always were." Irene nodded, the weight of Gwen's words sinking in. She didn't need to speak. Gwen had always understood, had always seen more than the surface of things. Soon Lily joined them, and with her came a spark of something Irene hadn't expected. Urgency. She sat down at the table and looked at the scattered photos, her expression intense but gentle. "These aren't just memories," Lily said, her voice firm with the same conviction Irene had always seen in her when she picked up a camera. "These are the moments they tried to erase, and they need to be seen." Irene met her granddaughter's eyes, searching for something she couldn't quite name. Lily wasn't just helping her. Lily was co-creating her legacy, piece by piece. "I'm ready," Irene whispered. The words were simple, but they held everything she'd been carrying. "Let's do it." The three of them worked long into the night, sorting and selecting, choosing portraits that captured more than just a smile. Some were old, taken in a time when life still felt expansive. Others were new, candid moments that spoke of a life lived fully, even if it had been overlooked. Together, they pieced together a collection that was her, unapologetically. When they finally had enough, they sat back and admired the exhibit they had created, a reflection of Irene as she truly was. Complex, beautiful, alive. Gwen leaned back in her chair and grinned. "Uncropped," she said, as if the name had been waiting for someone to say it aloud. Irene felt the truth of it settle into her chest. Uncropped. It was perfect. She was perfect, despite what Kelsey had tried to hide. The world had only ever seen fragments of Irene, but this exhibit would change that. With the exhibit named and ready, Irene picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the keys as she composed the invitation. She could already feel the tension in her bones, the confrontation that would come. But it wasn't fear that held her. It was something sharper, something stronger. The invitation was simple, direct. "You are cordially invited to view the exhibit uncropped at the Savannah Gallery." She added a sticky note to the envelope, her handwriting precise but unmistakable in its resolve. "I thought you loved photos." She sat back, her breath coming slow and steady, then slipped the invitation into the envelope. She could already picture Kelsey's face when she opened it. The sting of it would be unmistakable. Later that day, Kelsey posted a selfie from brunch, as expected. A flawless, edited image of herself, her smile radiant and her caption even more so, "Blessed with beauty and grace." Irene almost smiled at the irony. Kelsey was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to curate her world. But it was too late. The world would see Irene now. They would see the woman Kelsey had tried to erase, the mother, the grandmother, the photographer. Irene wasn't in the background anymore. She was in the frame, and she wasn't leaving. The Savannah Gallery was small, intimate in the way only old, weathered buildings could be, like a quiet room where secrets were tucked into every crevice. The walls, cream-colored and neutral, were filled with the weight of history, but it was Irene's exhibit that would echo through them now. There was no press, no grand opening gala with champagne or photographers snapping images of the rich and famous. There was no fanfare, only the quiet hum of the gallery, the soft shuffle of footsteps on the old wooden floors, and the occasional murmur of someone pausing before one of Irene's photos. The art spoke louder than any applause ever could. Irene stood off to the side, her hands folded loosely in front of her, watching as the crowd trickled in. Some of them were curious passers-by. Some of them, perhaps, had seen the invite and been intrigued by the personal message attached. But none of them could have known what they were about to witness. The walls were lined with portraits, some ancient, some recent, and each one had a title card beneath it. Simple, handwritten captions, almost like whispers beneath the photographs. Each one a fragment of the truth. Uncropped was the name of the show. But it wasn't just the photos that were uncropped. It was the entire experience, the vulnerability, the unflinching honesty. Each image captured Irene in a way she'd never allowed before. In moments of life that didn't conform to the perfect sanitized family portraits that Kelsey had tried so hard to cultivate. These photos were Irene unfiltered. Gwen, standing beside Irene, leaned in, her voice a low chuckle. "You know, if she wanted flattery, she should have behaved," Gwen said, her eyes twinkling with that mischievous edge Irene had always admired. Irene didn't smile, but a quiet sense of satisfaction settled over her. Gwen was right. Flattery had never been her goal. But the truth? That was something worth showing. The photos spoke for themselves. There was Irene laughing, flour dusting her face as she baked in her kitchen. Irene sitting in a worn armchair, a cup of tea in hand, the sunlight filtering through the curtains behind her like something out of a dream. There were moments where she was alive, not as Kelsey had tried to hide her, but as she was, full of life, full of feeling, full of herself. The next room, however, told a different story. It was where Kelsey's perfectly curated images hung, all shiny smiles, pristine family portraits, and effortless poses. The pictures where Irene was almost invisible. Kelsey's world, perfectly polished and controlled. But those images couldn't compete with the rawness of Irene's truth. Kelsey had tried to erase Irene from their family's story, but here she was, front and center, no longer hidden. Carter walked in with Kelsey, his steps deliberate. He'd been quiet so far, but now he moved to the wall, his eyes flicking from photo to photo, scanning with a certain discomfort. He didn't speak for a moment, but the tension in the air was palpable. Finally, he broke the silence. "You're making us look bad," Carter said, his voice low, edged with frustration. His gaze darted around the room, avoiding Irene's eyes. He couldn't hide the irritation that tugged at the corners of his mouth. Irene didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady by her side, her gaze fixed firmly on him. She'd spent years learning how to stay calm, how to let the world swirl around her without getting caught in it. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but unyielding. "No, I'm making you visible." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room seemed to still. Kelsey shifted uncomfortably, her eyes scanning the walls. But it was Gwen who broke the silence with a burst of laughter. "Of course, Carter. You've never been good with the truth." Pastor Elias, who had arrived quietly, stood nearby, his presence calm and watchful. He moved to the final panel where the centerpiece of the exhibit hung. An image of Kelsey, posed just as she liked to be. Perfect, centered, flawless. But Irene had chosen this particular photograph carefully. The caption beneath it read, "Centered in every frame." Still managed to miss the point. The words were simple, but they cut to the heart of it all. It was the perfect counterpoint to the image. The woman who always wanted to be in the center, but who had missed the point of what family and truth really meant. Kelsey, her lips pressed into a tight line, stepped forward. Her eyes narrowed as she read the caption. And for the first time, Irene saw something break in her. A flicker of realization. Something raw. Something human. But Kelsey didn't stay to reflect. She turned on her heel, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she stormed out of the gallery. Irene watched her go, her expression unreadable, but a small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her lips. The sting had been expected, but it was still difficult to watch. Kelsey was still trying to protect the illusion, still clinging to the world she had tried to build for herself. But that world was cracking, and there was no running from the truth now. Irene didn't chase after her daughter-in-law. She didn't need to. The photographs on the walls were louder than anything she could say. And the world was finally seeing them, finally hearing the stories she had always tried to tell. The walls spoke louder than they ever could. The truth was on display. And Irene was finally seen. The quiet hum of Savannah's streets was interrupted by the chime of Irene's phone, her hand lingering on the handle of a teacup she'd long since forgotten. It was a Monday, a full week since the exhibit had opened, and the world was slowly starting to notice. The air was different now, sharp, expectant. A local arts magazine had picked up on the buzz, and an interview had been scheduled. Lily had insisted on doing it. Irene hadn't questioned it. She'd known it was coming. The soft click of a door signaled Lily's arrival, her presence calm, yet filled with the quiet urgency that came from someone stepping fully into their purpose. She set the magazine on the table before Irene and took a seat. The title of the article glared up from the cover, "The Woman Behind the Lens, Uncropped." "Looks like they're paying attention," Lily said with a small smile, but there was a gleam in her eyes that suggested the attention hadn't all been expected. Irene nodded, taking in the pages, absorbing the weight of the words that would soon carry her name to a larger audience. She was glad it was Lily. Her granddaughter had always seen her, truly seen her, in ways others had tried to dismiss. It was only fitting that it was Lily who would tell the story. When the interview began, Lily spoke with the grace of someone who had inherited not just her grandmother's talent for photography, but the quiet power that came with it. Her voice was steady as she answered questions about the exhibit, about the photos, about what Irene had wanted to say with Uncropped. "My grandmother taught me to see the soul, especially the ones people try to erase," Lily said, her words deliberate but never rehearsed. There was no need for embellishment. She simply spoke the truth, the same truth that had been framed on the walls of that small gallery. The reporter, a woman in her 30s with round glasses and an inquisitive stare, nodded, scribbling furiously. Lily's words had struck a chord. Irene watched her granddaughter, marveling at how far she had come. The quiet observer had transformed into the voice of their story, and it was undeniable. But the real weight of the article would come later, not from the accolades or the press, but from the reactions that came in the form of whispers, phone calls, and angry rants. At church that Sunday, Gwen, ever the lively participant in Savannah's social scene, had fielded more than one call from the church ladies, who, like clockwork, had noticed the buzz surrounding Irene's exhibit. "Is this about Kelsey?" one of the women had asked, her voice frail but sharp, a clear implication in her tone. Gwen's reply came with her usual ease. If the shoe fits, post it. The laughter that followed was dry, knowing. Gwen wasn't afraid of social repercussions, especially when it came to defending her oldest friend. Meanwhile, Kelsey had turned to her usual method of control, a group text message. The words were a flurry of anger, but each sentence was carefully constructed, like a shield meant to deflect the accusations that lingered beneath her perfect social media facade. "She's humiliating us on purpose," Kelsey ranted, as though the world had been unjustly burdened by Irene's honesty. Carter, predictably, remained quiet at first, but he eventually weighed in. "Then maybe apologize," he suggested, his tone flat, as though offering a solution without truly caring whether it would be taken. But Kelsey didn't apologize. She never did. The damage had been done, and in her mind, there was nothing to regret. She had never understood Irene's desire to be seen. She had always understood control. And in Kelsey's mind, the truth was an inconvenience, a tool to be used or discarded. Back at Irene's house, life moved at its own pace, slow but determined. The evening fell, and with it, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was delicate but strong, an old-fashioned script that caught Irene's eye before she even opened it. She unfolded the letter carefully, her fingers trembling just slightly, the paper soft against her skin. The words on the page were simple, but their meaning was profound. "I saw myself in your silence." Irene read the sentence over and over, the words echoing in her mind. A stranger, someone she would never meet, had understood her, had seen the truth that Irene had lived with all these years, the same truth she'd carried in her chest and poured into the exhibit. "I saw myself in your silence." It was a message that spoke to her in ways the gallery, the photographs, and even the article couldn't. It was validation, of a kind. Irene had been right to be seen, right to expose what had been hidden for so long. The woman who had spent years behind the camera, capturing others but never allowing herself to be captured, had finally revealed herself. And the world was listening, or, at least, the ones who mattered were. Irene's breath caught as the weight of the letter settled over her. The truth had found a voice. And it wasn't just her truth anymore. It was everyone's truth, the ones who had been forgotten, erased, or pushed into silence. As she placed the letter back in its envelope, Irene stood up, her resolve stronger than ever. Kelsey's fury, Carter's indifference, they didn't matter anymore. Irene had stepped into the light, and there was no going back now. The world was finally seeing her, and the voices that had been silent for so long were finally being heard. Lily had always been the quiet one, the observer, the person who saw details others missed. But today, she had become the voice of their revolution. The world had seen the exhibit, and the article had already stirred the pot. But it was the photo she posted next that truly set the fire blazing. The image was one Irene had nearly forgotten. Irene in the kitchen, laughing with flour smeared across her face. Her hair was wild, her apron stained with streaks of dough, and there was no hint of the perfectly posed, polished woman the world was used to seeing. It was a raw, unfiltered moment, a moment of genuine joy. Lily's caption was simple, yet powerful, unedited joy. Irene stared at the post, the words sinking in. This was the image she had kept hidden for so long, the one Kelsey would have rejected, the one she would have erased. Yet here it was, front and center, for everyone to see. It was a truth, unembellished, untouched. The post went viral within hours. Art students shared it, calling it a triumphant reclamation of identity. Elder rights groups picked it up as a symbol of the unspoken dignity of aging, of living fully even when the world tries to erase your worth. Memoir blogs reposted it, turning it into an anthem for anyone who had ever felt invisible. Irene could barely keep up with the notifications on her phone. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. People were seeing her, really seeing her, in a way they never had before. She was no longer a background figure in her own life, she was the center. But then, as quickly as the joy spread, the backlash came. It didn't take long for Kelsey to notice. She was the last person to embrace any vulnerability. And this was a direct challenge to the version of their family she had tried to control. She couldn't let it stand. Kelsey sent a string of messages, furious and frantic, trying to claim that the exhibit, the entire gallery, had been taken out of context. It wasn't a surprise. This was her playbook. When things got messy, she tried to shift the narrative, erase the pain, twist the truth. But there was no ignoring what was right in front of her. Lily didn't back down. She posted another response. The context was always there. You just didn't want to see it. But Irene had one more piece to add. The next morning, her phone buzzed with a message. It was the raw audio from Easter brunch. The audio Kelsey had thought would remain buried, the words Kelsey had never expected to be recorded. Irene opened the file and listened to the moment Kelsey had whispered that stinging line. She really should stay out of photos. It's better. The words were as clear as day, sharper than any photo could ever be. Irene calmly attached the file to a message and sent it out. One word: uncropped. It didn't take long before the comment section lit up. Some people expressed shock, some disgust, but the truth was out. Kelsey had framed herself, not just in the photos, but in her own lies. Gwen called Irene later that afternoon, her voice laced with amusement. She framed herself, didn't she? Irene didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. She had said everything she needed to say. The world had heard the truth. Meanwhile, Carter, predictably, stayed silent. He was the quiet observer now, no longer the son who had once tried to smooth over their fractures. But silence, as Irene had learned, spoke volumes. He didn't have the courage to stand by his mother, not when it mattered. Cowardice didn't make noise. It just disappeared. Kelsey, of course, tried to threaten legal action. She couldn't stand the idea that her carefully curated world was crumbling. But she didn't understand the stakes. She didn't understand that truth had its own protection, that art had its own voice. Pastor Elias sent an email later that evening to Irene's lawyer. The exhibit is protected under truth. No action will be taken. The finality of his words settled over her like a wave. Irene hadn't just fought for herself. She had fought for the truth of all the voices that had been drowned out, buried beneath polished veneers and perfect social media posts. The world could see her now, and it wasn't just a flash in the pan. It was something that would last. But as the echoes of Kelsey's fury faded, Irene's heart remained steady. The truth had spoken louder than any words Kelsey had ever whispered. And in the silence that followed, Irene knew one thing for sure. She was done being erased. The day Irene received the final proof of seen still, she sat in her chair for a long time, the photo book spread out on the table before her. The cover was simple, just her name, in crisp black letters under the title. But inside, it was a collection of her life, uncensored, unapologetic. Each page was a quiet act of defiance, a refusal to be erased any longer. Lily had helped her design it, of course. The two of them had spent countless hours going through Irene's old negatives, finding photos that had been buried, neglected, or discarded. Some were from before, the time when Irene was full of hope, when she took pictures that captured not just the image, but the essence of the person. Others were from the exhibit, the raw, real moments of her life that had been overlooked. Uncropped, just like the exhibit. No filter, no polishing, just truth. The book wasn't about the art. It wasn't about showcasing the perfect shot, the perfect light, or the perfect smile. It was about the honesty of being seen, being truly seen, not just in the way Kelsey had carefully curated her life, but in the messy, unfiltered, real moments that had always existed. When the pre-orders came in, Irene was stunned by the response. It wasn't just art collectors or photography enthusiasts buying it. It was people who had been waiting for this, who had waited to see the real woman behind the smiles and the perfectly posed family photos. The orders flooded in like a wave, and it wasn't because of the artistry, but because of the honesty. But the real victory came when Irene saw the proceeds that were pouring in. It wasn't just for her. All of it, every single penny, was going into a fund to support low-income elder artists. Irene wasn't just claiming her space, she was opening it for others, lifting up the voices that had been silenced for so long. She was changing the conversation about age, about beauty, about who got to tell their stories. Meanwhile, the ripple effect was growing. Kelsey had never been one to hide from discomfort, but this time, there was no avoiding the fallout. The story had gained traction. People were talking, sharing, and discussing the reality of the family's fractured narrative. Kelsey's real estate brand, which had once been a symbol of polished success, started to lose steam. Two major partnerships pulled out after the story went viral. Kelsey's social media posts, once full of self-congratulation and filters, became increasingly desperate as her followers dwindled. Carter was quiet for the most part, but when the pre-order numbers started coming in, his unease became more apparent. He didn't show up to the meetings Irene had arranged. He didn't acknowledge her calls. But a text from him late one evening caught her attention. "Can't you dial it back? This isn't helping anyone." Irene stared at the words for a long moment. She could feel the old ache in her chest, the frustration of trying to communicate with him, trying to get him to understand. But Lily, who had spent the night in the studio putting together a presentation of the first print run, was at Irene's side when the text came through. She glanced at the screen and smiled, a quiet defiance in her gaze. "She spent 30 years cropped out," Lily said, her voice steady, unshakable. "No, she's not dialing it back." Irene couldn't help but smile at the strength Lily had found. There were times when Irene had feared for her, when she saw the quiet way Lily had observed and held back. But now, Lily was her co-creator, her equal, the daughter she never had, the partner she never knew she needed. Gwen, too, was by Irene's side, continuing her brand of unfiltered humor and unwavering loyalty. She had been a regular presence at the gallery, at the studio, and even at church. The church ladies had unsurprisingly started talking, whispering behind polite fans and church hats, so Gwen decided to put her own stamp on it. One sunny afternoon, as the church's monthly book club gathered in the fellowship hall, Gwen marched into the library with a copy of Scene, still under her arm. She handed it to the librarian without a word, but the look she gave the room was enough. The church was going to have to contend with the truth, whether they liked it or not. By the time the book went live, and Irene's story became a quiet but undeniable movement, Kelsey's frustration reached a boiling point. She had finally seen the book for herself. Her carefully curated world was now on full display, and the last page, the one that Irene had reserved just for her, was a portrait Kelsey had never seen. It was the one she had tried to hide, the one where her own smile was too sharp, her posture too stiff, her eyes not quite reaching the camera. Kelsey stared at the photograph for a long time. It was in black and white, capturing her just the way Irene had always seen her. Perfect on the surface, but hollow underneath. The caption underneath it was simple, centered in every frame, still managed to miss the point. The words stung, but it was the image itself that crushed Kelsey. She had spent years controlling the narrative, but Irene had captured her in a way that no one ever had. The truth was glaring. There was no hiding behind the polished perfection anymore. For a long moment, Kelsey just sat there, staring at the image. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she couldn't look away. The frame she had tried to escape from was now the only thing that mattered. Irene wasn't behind the lens anymore. She was in it. And she wasn't leaving. The night of the citywide juried exhibit was warm, the streets of Savannah humming with the usual evening energy. The air was thick with anticipation as locals and art lovers alike trickled into the gallery. But Irene, standing in the back of the room, was focused on one thing: the photograph that had been selected for the city's most prestigious event. The room buzzed with excitement, but when people approached the centerpiece, Matriarch interrupted. There was an odd, almost reverent hush. The picture was simple, yet it struck a chord. Irene sat at the head of an old wooden table alone, her hands folded on the surface. There were no family members around her, no bustling conversation, no laughter. The table was empty, save for the half-finished meal before her. The warm light from the chandelier overhead fell on her in such a way that it made her appear more like a sculpture than a person, frozen in time. The caption beneath it read, "She made the meals, they made the rules." But she outlived the edits. For the first time, Irene saw herself as she truly was. Not the woman who served, not the woman who cleaned, not the one who stayed in the shadows, but the one who had always been at the center, even if no one had ever recognized it. She had outlived the edits. Her life, her presence, was the truth, untouched, undeniable. The crowd around the piece was noticeably quiet, some whispering, others just staring. It was impossible to ignore the way Irene's eyes seemed to follow every visitor, the way her solitude in the photo forced them to confront what they had tried to ignore. Kelsey had shown up, of course. The gallery was too big of a stage for her to stay away. She moved through the crowd, her usual confident stride faltering as she neared Irene's piece. She glanced at it briefly but didn't linger, her eyes flicking to the floor as if avoiding the weight of the image. No one spoke to her. Not a word. She was invisible in the same way she had spent years making Irene feel invisible. Lily, on the other hand, was the star of the evening. The university had invited her to give a talk, and now she stood on the stage, poised, calm, and entirely sure of herself. The audience was entranced by her words as she spoke about the intersection of family, identity, and art, weaving in the story of how seen still had come to life. Irene watched her granddaughter, who had once been so quiet, now commanding the room with the same quiet strength that Irene had always admired. Lily was no longer just Irene's co-creator. She was a force in her own right. And as she spoke, Irene realized that Lily was carrying forward the legacy she had started. Irene had always feared that her voice wouldn't be heard, but now it was louder than ever. Meanwhile, Gwen was beside Irene, her eyes scanning the room with her usual wry smile. She hadn't come for the art, but for Irene. And as she watched Kelsey slip through the crowd, avoiding eye contact with anyone, she turned to Irene and whispered with a laugh, "Didn't think you'd get famous by being erased, huh?" Irene didn't reply, but the words resonated. Gwen's humor was the balm Irene needed. It reminded her that the past, the years of quiet suffering, the subtle ways her presence had been minimized, was now a memory. The present was hers, and it would not be erased. Carter, of course, was a ghost in the gallery. He had shown up, but the tension in his posture was palpable. He stood near the back, hands stuffed in his pockets, staring at the floor. He didn't look at Irene once. The room had shifted, and he couldn't bring himself to face her. His silence, the weight of it, seemed to speak louder than any words he could have said. When the night drew to a close, he slipped out quietly, making his exit before the final speeches were even made. He couldn't look his mother in the eye. He had never understood her. Not really. And now, seeing the woman she had become, the woman who was no longer willing to remain in the background of her own life, was more than he could bear. He left without a word, without even a glance toward the piece that had made everything so painfully clear. But as the gallery doors closed behind him, the rest of the room seemed to pulse with a quiet energy. The truth had been displayed in its rawest, most unapologetic form, and there was no erasing it now. Irene wasn't just in the frame. She was the frame. And the world had seen her, really seen her, for the first time. The walls of the gallery had been her witness, and no one could look away. The quiet hum of the evening lingered in Irene's chest, but there was no sorrow in it, only the sharp, sweet edge of vindication. She had outlived the edits, and now, in the quiet aftermath, Irene knew she would never be invisible again. The truth had been told, and she was the one who told it. The bouquet arrived on a Thursday morning. Its scent so sickly sweet that it felt like an insult even before Irene saw the card. The delivery driver, all smiles and oblivious cheer, handed it to her with a polite nod, and Irene took it, her fingers gripping the vase as if it might shatter from the weight of her disappointment. The card was simple, the handwriting neat but cold. "We didn't mean it." Irene stared at the words, feeling them dull her thoughts like a blade scraping across stone. She could hear Carter's voice in her head, strained, empty, always trying to smooth things over. It had been his way for years. He never really saw her. Not then, not now. And this was his idea of an apology. She set the bouquet down on the kitchen table, turning away from it, unable to stomach the fragile sincerity. The scent of the flowers seemed to choke her, a reminder of the things left unsaid for too long. Gwen was already standing by the counter watching Irene carefully, her brow raised as Irene made no move to acknowledge the bouquet. "I thought you might throw it out," Gwen said, her voice dry and amused, as always. Irene didn't respond immediately. Her hands hovered over the bouquet, the feel of the card in her fingers like a thread unraveling her composure. Finally, with a sharp movement, she picked it up and walked to the trash can. The flowers, the card, the flimsy apology, all of it went into the bin. No ceremony, no second thought. "Too cheap to be flowers," Gwen added, her voice a playful mockery. "Smells like shame." Irene chuckled darkly, the sound breaking the tension in her chest, but her eyes never strayed from the trash can. "It's the truth," she said quietly, her voice steady now. "The truth is all I need. Not cheap flowers and empty words." Gwen moved beside her, giving her a knowing look. "You're done with them, huh?" "I've been done for years," Irene said, her voice firm, but something deep in her gaze softened. She felt a kind of relief settling over her, the finality of it, the quiet weight of all those years of pretense finally lifting. They don't get to explain it now. They already told their truth. The days that followed were quieter, the kind of quiet that follows a storm when you're left standing in the wreckage, watching everything shift around you. There was no more pretending. No more would-have-beens or could-have-beens. The world had seen Irene's truth. And now, it was clear that the rest of the family was still trying to pretend they hadn't played their parts in it all. Kelsey, predictably, made another attempt to reconcile. This time, it was with a carefully crafted text message asking if Irene would meet her for coffee. It was cordial, polite, and utterly devoid of sincerity. Irene couldn't help but smile to herself when she saw it. "Do you think she actually believes you'll meet her?" Gwen asked when Irene showed her the message. "No," Irene replied, shaking her head. "She thinks I'll forgive her, though. And that's what makes it laughable." Irene didn't respond to the message. There was nothing to say. Kelsey wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking to be excused. Later that week, Pastor Elias arrived at Irene's house to finalize her will. The moment had come, the final piece of Irene's legacy about to be sealed. She'd had time to think about it, to think about what she wanted to leave behind. Not wealth, not material things, but a message, a testament to everything she had fought for, everything she had endured. Pastor Elias was meticulous, reviewing each detail as he handed her the 2 copies. He made no move to leave, his expression calm but knowing. "Everything's in order," he said softly. "No loopholes, no way to undo it." Irene looked at the papers in her hands, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of the future pressing against her chest. The truth had been spoken, and now it would be documented. Irene Whitmore had lived her life on her terms, and now, no one could take that away. The day Irene handed a signed copy of Scene, still to Lily for the university's Memory Care Center, her heart was calm. This was her last gift, not to Kelsey, not to Carter, but to everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. The book was signed simply, "From Irene." It wasn't about recognition, it was about legacy. "I know you'll carry it forward," Irene said softly, her eyes meeting Lily's. "This is yours now." Lily nodded, her face serious but full of pride. "We're telling the truth," she said quietly, and Irene knew it wasn't just about the book. It was about the world they were helping to create. A world where no one had to hide anymore. Back at home, Irene's phone buzzed again. Another post from Kelsey. It was a quote. One Kelsey had probably found on some self-help blog to soothe her wounded pride. "Bitterness is aging." It had a few likes, but Irene wasn't interested in the numbers. She didn't need to read the words again. She already knew what Kelsey was trying to do. Redirect the conversation, paint herself as the victim. But Irene wasn't biting. She'd learned long ago not to take the bait. And this time, it was clear. The real bitterness had always come from the way she had been silenced, from the way her voice, her life, her story had been ignored. The silence wasn't hers anymore, and this time, no one could take it back. The ceremony was held on a crisp fall afternoon, the kind of day where the sky felt like a promise, clear and limitless. The university's new photography wing was bustling, its grand opening a celebration of history, vision, and, above all, legacy. The announcement of the Irene Whitmore Photography Scholarship had been met with widespread support, but Irene had always known that the most important part of it all was what came after: the work, the truth, and the lasting impact of her story. Lily stood at the podium, her presence commanding the room. As the lead advisor for the scholarship, it was her task to speak to the legacy Irene had left, a legacy that would endure far beyond Irene's time. The crowd of photographers, art students, and community members listened intently as Lily spoke with quiet passion. "This scholarship isn't just about providing funding," Lily said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about ensuring that every voice, every face, has the opportunity to be framed, to be seen for who they truly are, especially the ones who have been silenced for too long. My grandmother, Irene Whitmore, taught me that every face deserves framing, even mine." The audience was silent, absorbing the weight of her words. Irene sat in the front row, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was no need for her to speak. Lily had done it for her. The scholarship wasn't just Irene's victory. It was the victory of every woman who had ever been overlooked, every artist whose voice had been muted. The dedication plaque stood to the side of the stage, its brass plate gleaming in the soft light. It read simply, in Irene's own handwriting, "Every face deserves framing, even mine." Lily took a breath, her eyes sweeping over the crowd before she stepped aside to allow the unveiling of the plaque. The room was hushed, the energy palpable as the black cloth was removed, revealing the words that would stand as Irene's final testament. The dedication wasn't just to the scholarship, it was a declaration. She had been framed, unfiltered, and unedited. Now, she would remain visible forever. Backstage, Kelsey had arrived late, slipping in just as the ceremony began. She hadn't bothered to speak to anyone, her eyes flicking around the room in search of an ally. When the dedication plaque was revealed, she crossed her arms over her chest, a flicker of resentment passing over her face. She had never understood the kind of recognition Irene had earned, and now it seemed impossible to escape the shadow Irene had cast. Kelsey's attempt to insert herself into the narrative had been clear from the beginning. She had tried, with all her might, to have her name included in the press release about the scholarship. She wanted to be part of the story, a contributor in some way. But when she made her request, it was met with silence. The decision had already been made. Her name was nowhere to be found, and she was left to watch the legacy she had tried to erase unfold without her. When she approached the table later to ask for a copy of the press kit, the receptionist politely informed her that only Irene's closest family and collaborators were included in the materials. The omission was a quiet but unmistakable rebuke. As the ceremony wrapped up, Carter arrived, his steps slow and hesitant. He had not been invited to speak, and no one had expected him to attend. But there he was, looking out of place, as always. He hovered near the back of the room, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes darting nervously around the crowd. When he noticed Irene in the front row, he quickly turned his back, retreating into the corner as if avoiding her gaze would somehow absolve him. The irony of it wasn't lost on Irene. He had been absent when she needed him, distant when she fought to be seen. Now, in this moment of triumph, he couldn't even bring himself to look her in the eye. As the crowd began to thin, Gwen approached Irene, a warm smile on her face. She was still wearing her cowboy boots, her posture as unapologetic as ever. She looked toward the stage where Lily was greeting people, then turned to Irene with a wink. "She didn't ask to be remembered," Gwen said, her voice rich with affection and mischief. "She made it impossible to forget her." Irene laughed, a soft chuckle that only Gwen could provoke. The years of struggle, the years of being ignored, now seemed a distant memory. She had carved her place in the world. No one could take that from her now. Pastor Elias, who had remained a quiet but steadfast presence throughout the evening, stood from his seat in the back. His arms were folded across his chest, his eyes watching Irene with a calm satisfaction. The moment was his too. He had helped her through this journey, had seen the truth of who Irene was long before the rest of the world had. And now, watching her sit so resolutely in her place of honor, he nodded to himself, his heart swelling with pride. The stone the builders rejected had become the cornerstone. Kelsey, still seething in the back, couldn't bring herself to stay for the closing speeches. She turned on her heel, her phone already in hand. As the crowd lingered in the gallery, she watched the live stream of the dedication ceremony from the solitude of her car, the screen lit up by the gleaming plaque, the words that seemed to burn into her. "Every face deserves framing, even mine." She had tried to bury Irene's story, erase it from the family narrative. But the truth had found its place, and Kelsey would never be able to run from it. Alone in her car, the only sound was the faint hum of the engine. Kelsey swiped away the tears that had formed, but they were too late. The world had moved on without her, and the silence, the one she had mistaken for forgiveness, had spoken volumes. Irene passed away quietly in her sleep, her hand resting gently in Lily's. It wasn't a dramatic exit. No sudden gasp for air, no lingering suffering. Just the soft exhale of a woman who had lived her life on her own terms, who had fought for visibility and, in the end, had secured her place in history. Lily had been at her side through it all. From the late-night talks in the studio to the quiet moments when Irene's strength faltered, Lily had always been there. And now, in the final moments, it was Lily who held her hand, the last of the Whitmore line to truly understand who Irene had been. The weight of it settled on her heart, a quiet grief mixed with the certainty that her grandmother's legacy was now hers to carry. The memorial service was held a few days later, and Irene's life was honored not with elaborate displays, but with simplicity. No slideshow, no excessive eulogies, just portraits. Portraits of Irene throughout the years, each one framed carefully, each one unedited, unpolished, and unapologetically true. She had lived her life for these moments, for the faces she captured, the lives she touched. Each frame on the wall whispered her truth. Guests moved through the room in hushed reverence, pausing at each photograph. The quiet was heavier than any spoken words. It wasn't a funeral for a perfect woman. It was a memorial for a woman who had carved her space in the world, fought for it, and had made sure she would be remembered. At the entrance, each guest was handed a small envelope, a portrait of Irene inside. Alongside it, a blank note card with a simple prompt: "Write what you remember. Truth only." No one spoke for a long while. The quiet of the room was intentional. There was no need for speeches when Irene had already said everything that needed to be said in her photographs, in her life. The truth of who she was stood in the frames, around the room, in every candid shot and every posed moment. She had captured the faces of her family, her friends, her world, and now they would be forced to reckon with her. Gwen stood at the back, watching as people moved through the room, wiping away tears, pausing at the portraits, reflecting on the woman who had spent so many years behind the lens. She hadn't known Irene as well as Lily did, but she had loved her, fiercely. Gwen was never one for dramatics, but this was Irene's moment. It was Gwen who had volunteered to read the eulogy, a final piece of Irene's work. She stood up at the front, the envelope in her hand, and she read the words Irene had written herself. They were simple, but powerful. "I didn't ask to be remembered. I made it impossible to forget me." The room was still. Irene's own words, read aloud by someone else, felt like a charge, like a call to arms for anyone who had ever been overlooked, anyone who had ever been silenced. Irene had fought, but in the end, she had won. The world had seen her, heard her, and no one could ever erase her again. When the ceremony was over, Pastor Elias stepped forward to deliver the estate documents. The weight of the moment was clear as he opened the envelope, his voice steady but firm. He looked first at Kelsey and Carter, who were sitting at the back, their faces tight with expectation. "Irene has made her wishes clear," Pastor Elias began. "There will be no exceptions." Kelsey and Carter's eyes darted between each other, the tension rising. They had expected something, had hoped for something. Some token. Some piece of what Irene had left behind. But there was nothing. Not for them. "Kelsey Whitmore," Pastor Elias said with quiet authority, "you will receive nothing. Neither will you, Carter Whitmore. Irene's legacy is not for you to inherit." The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Kelsey's jaw clenched, but she remained silent. Carter looked away, unable to meet anyone's eyes. For the first time in a long while, they were powerless. The truth had been put into action, and Irene had made her intentions clear. Pastor Elias turned the page of the will and continued, his eyes settling on Lily. "Lily Whitmore, you are the beneficiary of Irene's estate. The archive, the royalties from Scene, Still, and the keys to the studio are now yours." Lily stood, her back straight, her hands trembling slightly but her face set in determination. She wasn't just Irene's granddaughter. She was the future. The keys to the studio in her hands weren't just a gesture. They were the weight of a future that would be shaped by the truths Irene had spent her life telling. As the family filed out of the room, Kelsey stayed behind for a moment. She pulled the envelope from her coat pocket and tore it open. Inside, there was only an empty frame. Nothing. The emptiness hit her with the force of a blow. She had spent so many years trying to control the narrative, trying to hold the reins of their family's story. But now, it was clear. Irene had won. Her legacy had been built, and it was one Kelsey would never be able to change. She stared at the empty frame for a long time. As the truth, the one Kelsey had tried to bury, loomed over her. She had tried to erase Irene, but she couldn't erase the frame. She couldn't erase the truth. And in the silence that followed, Kelsey finally understood. She was never going to be the center of this story. The world was finally seeing Irene, and no one could unsee her. Months had passed since the memorial, but Irene's influence continued to grow, an indelible imprint on everything she'd touched. It was the quiet ripple of her legacy that kept unfolding, even when those who had once tried to erase her now had no choice but to bear witness to it. Scene still was officially integrated into the university's curriculum. Students studying photography now learned about Irene Whitmore's work, not just for the artistry, but for the truth that had been laid bare in her frames. Her candid shots, her unfiltered moments, became a cornerstone of the course. Professors spoke of her with reverence. Students drew inspiration from her bravery. Every face in her portfolio, the ones she had captured, raw and unapologetic, spoke to the students in ways that felt like a living history. They saw themselves in Irene, in her art, in the moments she had chosen to share with the world. Lily, now an established name in her own right, found herself invited to speak at elder justice conferences across the state. She talked about her grandmother, but her message was clear. This wasn't just about a photographer. It was about dignity, about visibility for those whose voices had been ignored. Her talks weren't lectures, they were calls to action. She told the stories no one wanted to hear, Lily said at one conference, her voice steady but filled with conviction. And she made sure those stories were never erased again. At the same time, Gwen, ever the force of nature, took up her own pen. She'd never been one to back down from telling the truth, and she had a story to tell. Her memoir, You Should Have Smiled for the Camera, quickly gained traction. It was equal parts history and personal reflection, a raw, no-holds-barred recounting of her years of friendship with Irene. Gwen's sharp wit and unflinching honesty turned her book into a cultural touchstone for those who, like Irene, had never been granted the grace of perfection. It was a hit in art circles and beyond, a reminder that sometimes the loudest truths were the ones that stung the most. But for Kelsey, it was all unraveling. Her once carefully curated social media presence, the perfect family photos, the carefully crafted persona, all began to crumble. Every post was met with the unrelenting weight of quotes from the exhibit, from Scene, Still, from Irene's words. Her followers dwindled as the truth of her manipulations spread. She couldn't hide behind her polished smile anymore. The whispers had grown into a chorus, and Kelsey couldn't silence them. The glossy veneer she had spent her life building was cracking, piece by piece, as the public turned their attention toward the very woman she had tried to suppress. Her desperate attempts to control the narrative fell flat. A hashtag emerged, uncropped, and it flooded her feed. There was no escaping it. Irene had reframed the conversation. And now, no one was listening to Kelsey. Not anymore. Carter, always the one to sidestep real confrontation, did the one thing he had always done best. He disappeared. His resignation from the city council committee was quiet, without fanfare, a mere note in the paper. There were no public statements, no declarations. It was as if he'd never been there at all. He was a man who had tried to remain in the background his entire life, and now he had been erased, just like the shadows he preferred to occupy. Pastor Elias, too, continued to spread Irene's message. At a youth summit on social justice, his voice rang out, powerful in its simplicity. Tell the truth. Frame it yourself. The crowd, a mix of young activists and students, listened raptly. The words were a clarion call. Irene had framed her own truth, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, pushed aside. Pastor Elias spoke of her with reverence, quoting her, bringing her wisdom to a new generation of young people who had never known the struggle to be seen. And then, Irene's self-portrait was placed in the State Museum, joining the ranks of the greats. It was displayed alongside works that had shaped history, her face now permanently etched into the fabric of the state's cultural legacy. There it was, hanging in a place of honor, the very same face that Kelsey had tried so hard to crop out, now hanging in a space where it could never again be ignored. The plaque beneath the portrait was simple, but it captured the essence of what Irene had fought for. It read, Irene Whitmore, photographer, artist, advocate for truth. The truth of who she had been, the truth of what she had done, now stood in a place where it could never be erased again. Kelsey sat alone in her car, staring at the live stream of the ceremony. She had tried to bury Irene's legacy, had tried to control the narrative, to pretend that her role in the story had been that of the hero. But the world was now seeing Irene for what she truly was, the woman who had refused to be silenced. Kelsey's finger hovered over her phone screen, the glare of the live stream reflecting in her eyes. She had nothing left to say. Nothing she posted could change what had been done. Irene's truth had become an unshakable foundation. And in that moment, Kelsey finally understood. She was never going to be at the center of this story. No matter how much she tried to control the frame, she could never outshine Irene's light. It was impossible to forget her now. As the camera cut to the final shot of the self-portrait in the museum, Kelsey let the phone fall to her lap. The screen went dark, but the truth remained, and no one could unsee it. Kelsey's appeal came swiftly, a last-ditch attempt to claw her way into Irene's estate. The package was neat, meticulously bound, filled with the same polished arguments she had used for years to control the narrative. This time, though, her words fell on deaf ears. The legal team barely glanced at the document before filing it in the denied pile. 10 minutes, and her claims were dismissed. The denial came with an official letter, one that Irene had carefully planned, one that made it clear the legacy was not for Kelsey, not for Carter. The words were simple, but the finality of them cut deeper than Kelsey had anticipated. This was not your inheritance to claim. She stared at the letter for a long time, her fingers trembling as she crushed it in her hand. She had expected a fight, had hoped that she might still bend the system to her will, but the words felt like an insurmountable wall. The estate's final decision had been made. She had been erased. Carter, meanwhile, wasn't one to face rejection head-on. Instead, he wrote a letter to Lily, one last attempt to mend the frayed relationship. He was never good with confrontation, always retreating into passivity, and this letter was his way of reaching out without truly exposing himself. He wrote it the way he had lived, filled with apologies that carried no weight. It was a generic plea for forgiveness, an attempt to regain a piece of the family he had neglected. But when Lily opened the letter, she didn't read it. She didn't need to. Instead, she saw the postscript. It was a quote from Irene, one that she had written in her own hand years ago, now highlighted in bold on the page. If they forget you, remind them by creating. Lily put the letter down without a word. Carter would never understand what it meant to truly create. She wasn't about to waste her time on words that hadn't been earned. The legacy wasn't his to claim anymore. As the weeks passed, Gwen made another bold move. She sold one of Irene's most iconic photographs, The Uncentered Woman, to a national gallery. It wasn't just a sale, it was a statement. The photograph, a powerful image of a woman lost in the midst of the family chaos, encapsulated Irene's entire ethos. It had always been about the truth that was impossible to ignore, the beauty that shone even in the absence of approval. The proceeds from the sale went to fund more scholarships, specifically, those that would help artists who had been marginalized by age, race, or background. And not one dime of it would go to Carter. It was the kind of gesture that made the message clear. Irene's wealth, both financial and cultural, was being used to support the future. The future Irene had fought to carve out for those whose stories were never told. Lily was there when the gallery made the announcement. She had inherited not just the estate, but the responsibility of keeping Irene's voice alive. It was her duty, and she carried it without hesitation. She wasn't just living in Irene's shadow anymore. She was shaping the world Irene had envisioned. One day, while sorting through Irene's studio, Lily found a note tucked into the back of one of Irene's old journals. It was written in her familiar script, the ink slightly smudged with time but still legible. If they forget you, remind them by creating. The words hit Lily harder than she expected. She felt the weight of Irene's legacy in them, a reminder that her grandmother had never been just a passive observer in her own life. Irene had created to remind the world of her truth. And now it was Lily's turn to continue that work. With the sale of Irene's art, the scholarships, and the museum placements, Lily knew there was no turning back. Her grandmother had done the hard work of carving out space in the world. Now it was time to make sure that space was never erased. In the midst of it all, Pastor Elias filed the final closure of the estate. There were no outstanding claims, no arguments, no lingering questions. Everything had been settled, and Irene's legacy was untouchable. The papers were finalized, and the estate was closed for good. No one could challenge it anymore. But Kelsey wasn't finished. A few days later, a bill arrived at Irene's old house, addressed to Kelsey in bold, unforgiving letters, the bill for legal fees. She had thought she could recoup her costs from the estate, but the terms were clear. No reimbursement allowed. Kelsey opened the envelope with trembling hands, her chest tightening. It wasn't just the rejection that stung. It was the final brutal reminder that Irene had always been in control. Kelsey looked at the bill for a long moment, the words on the paper blurring together. It was a small sum compared to the inheritance she'd hoped for, but it felt like the last shred of control she'd ever had, slipping away. She crumpled the bill in her hands, throwing it to the floor. It didn't matter. The damage had been done. The legacy had already been secured, and she couldn't take it back. As the days passed, the world moved on, and Irene's influence only grew. Kelsey's voice became a whisper in the wind, drowned out by the truth Irene had framed for the world. The silence that followed her rejection was no longer hers to claim. The world had seen Irene, and no one could unsee her. The frame had been set, and there was no way to remove it, no matter how hard Kelsey tried. Kelsey stood by the hors d'oeuvres table at the networking event, the hum of conversation around her a constant reminder of the weight she now carried. She used to be the center of attention in rooms like this, charming her way through conversations, making her mark with her impeccable image. Tonight, however, it felt different. She was an outsider in her own world. 3 people, none of them looking at her directly, whispered in the corner. Their voices, low but loud enough for Kelsey to catch every word, spoke of the exhibit, of the gallery, of Irene's legacy. None of it was flattering. One person muttered, "She had the audacity to frame her family like that," while another responded, "Who needs that kind of exposure? Family should stay private." The third, a woman Kelsey vaguely recognized, added, I can't believe she put them all on display like that. Kelsey's stomach twisted, but she didn't show it. She forced a smile and refocused on the shrimp cocktail she was holding, pretending it was more interesting than the conversation that was slipping through the cracks of her life. It wasn't just the people in the room, it was the world, and they were all reminding her of what she had lost: the control, the power, the ability to hide behind the narrative she'd so carefully constructed. Later, as Kelsey made her way to the restroom, her phone buzzed with a new notification. It was Carter, his text short and to the point. Just updated my resume. Removed, community photography sponsor. The words hit her like a slap. Carter had been so eager to protect their shared image, to keep up appearances, to hold on to whatever scraps of social standing he could. And now, it seemed, even he had accepted that their connection to Irene was over, that their family's name had been tainted. It was as if the thread between them had snapped, leaving them floundering in silence. He was the one who had always walked away from the confrontation, from the truth. But now, it was clear. There was no escape from the fallout. The night dragged on, and Kelsey could feel the growing distance between herself and the others. They were all talking about Lily, about the foundation she had started in Irene's name. A new name had emerged, a new face at the center of the narrative. The invitations had stopped coming for Kelsey and Carter. People stopped asking about them and started asking about Lily's work, about the Irene Whitmore Foundation, about what it meant for the future. Lily had become the face of the story Kelsey had spent years trying to control. It wasn't just the artwork or the exhibit. It was everything: the foundation, the scholarships, the legacy. Kelsey's name had been pushed aside, swept under the rug. And Lily? She was everywhere. A week later, Gwen invited everyone to a neighborhood dinner. It was an event that had always been an opportunity for networking, for appearing together as a family. But when the invitation came, Kelsey's name wasn't on it. She tried to act unbothered when she saw it, but the sting was real. Gwen hadn't invited her, not after everything that had unfolded. Instead, Gwen's dining room was filled with the laughter and conversation of the people who had supported Irene: the artists, the donors, the ones who had shown up for the legacy. Gwen didn't need to explain why Kelsey wasn't there. She didn't need to say a word. The absence was enough. Kelsey stood outside Gwen's house later that evening, leaning against her car as she looked in through the window. She saw Lily, surrounded by the guests, laughing with them, completely at ease. The moment felt like an eternity, and Kelsey realized she was on the outside. She'd been erased from the picture. The truth, that had once belonged to her, had been reclaimed. And she couldn't fight it anymore. Inside, Lily signed a grant request as the director of the Irene Whitmore Foundation. The weight of that title, the responsibility of carrying forward Irene's legacy, wasn't lost on her. The foundation was growing, just as her grandmother's influence had. Irene's name was being carried forward by the one person who truly understood it. Lily knew, in a way no one else could, that Irene's work wasn't just about photos. It was about truth, visibility, and the quiet revolution of being seen for who you truly were. And now, as she put pen to paper, it wasn't just a signature, it was a commitment. In another part of the city, a local school unveiled a darkroom dedicated to Irene. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. It wasn't just about photography, it was about teaching the next generation that their truth mattered, that their stories were worth telling. Kelsey walked by the school every week on her way to her car, but never once did she look inside. It felt like a betrayal to herself, like admitting the truth she had spent so long avoiding. The dark room stood there, a permanent reminder of what she had lost, of the legacy she had tried so hard to bury. Every time she walked by, the door was closed, and she refused to open it. The irony was inescapable. She could walk away from the truth, but the truth would never walk away from her. And that truth, framed and unfiltered, would forever stand in stark contrast to the carefully crafted illusions she had spent her life building. The silence that followed her rejection wasn't just hers to bear. The world had already moved on, and no matter how hard Kelsey tried, she couldn't rewrite the story. No matter how many times she walked by that dark room, no matter how many times she tried to pretend she didn't see it. The truth had been framed, and the frame was too strong to break. The gala room buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with conversation as guests milled about, nibbling on appetizers and exchanging polite greetings. The gallery had transformed, every inch of space a celebration of Irene Whitmore's life and work, but tonight was different. Tonight, a final portrait would be unveiled, one that would set the tone for the evening. Irene's face would be the last image they saw, framed in the soft glow of the spotlight, a reminder of what had been taken and what had been given back. The final photograph was simple, yet powerful. Irene, holding a camera, smiling directly at the viewer. She was no longer behind the lens, hidden in the shadows of her own life. Now, she was in the picture, as she had always been, staring back at the world that had tried to erase her. Beside the portrait, a quote in Irene's handwriting. She was always in the picture. You just refused to focus. The words felt like a challenge, a quiet defiance. The gallery had been filled with Irene's images for weeks, but this one, this final image, was the climax. It was her face, her truth, boldly on display. For the first time, she was truly visible, and nothing could take that away. Gwen, ever the fierce protector of Irene's legacy, stood beside the stage as the crowd took in the portrait. Her eyes were gleaming, her posture one of quiet satisfaction. When it was time, she stepped to the microphone, her voice cutting through the room with the clarity of someone who had seen it all. If you ever tried to crop her out, Gwen began, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the years, you misunderstood the assignment. The room fell silent for a heartbeat, everyone digesting the truth in her words. Gwen didn't need to say anything else. She had always understood Irene, perhaps better than anyone. She knew this was not just an exhibit. It was a statement. A challenge to a world that had often seen Irene only as an accessory, a background character in someone else's story. Gwen had always fought for her, but tonight, Irene's fight had been won. The lights dimmed, and a single spotlight illuminated the portrait. The silence deepened, becoming almost reverent. Guests stepped back, some wiping their eyes, others holding their breath. This wasn't just art. This was a declaration. Lily stood beside the portrait, her hand resting gently on the wood of the frame, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, though, were dry. She had cried her tears long ago, and now there was only the sense of completion, the quiet resolve that came with knowing her grandmother's legacy would not be forgotten. She had inherited the responsibility of carrying forward Irene's vision, but it wasn't a burden. It was a gift, one that had cost Irene everything. And tonight, Lily knew it was her turn to protect it, to make sure the world never forgot. From the back row, Pastor Elias sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, watching as the crowd absorbed the final image. He had always known Irene was destined for something greater than the family she had been trapped in. His eyes lingered on the portrait, his heart swelling with pride for his old friend. A prayer of closure whispered to himself, sealed the moment. He had always believed in the power of truth, and now that truth stood at the center of the room, unshakable. Kelsey had been absent from the gala. Her name had never been on the guest list, nor would it ever be again. She had faded into the background, her presence no longer required, her influence rendered irrelevant. Every attempt to insert herself back into the narrative had been futile. The truth, Irene's truth had solidified her place in history, and there was no room left for Kelsey in the frame. Outside, under the soft glow of the streetlights, Kelsey walked alone, her phone buzzing with notifications from the gallery. The live stream of the event was everywhere now. People were talking, sharing, discussing the portrait, the foundation, the scholarships. But Kelsey wasn't part of it. Her face didn't appear in any of the photos. Her name was absent from every caption. In the silence of the night, Kelsey could feel the weight of her own absence. The world had moved on without her. And Irene, with all her quiet resilience, had built an album that made sure she was never forgotten again. As Kelsey stared at the phone in her hand, the truth settled in. The world had finally seen Irene in all her raw, unfiltered glory, and there was no going back. I thought I could control the frame, Kelsey whispered to herself, but I was never in it. The phone slipped from her hand, hitting the ground with a soft thud. In that instant, she understood the magnitude of her failure. She had tried to make herself the center, tried to carve out her place in the story, but the frame had already been set. The truth had been told, and no one could unsee it. The camera pulled back, fading into the night as Irene's final portrait shone, unyielding and eternal. My daughter-in-law mocked my looks and said, "You should stay out of photos." So I built an album that made sure I was never forgotten again.